And the pictures say it far more powerfully than any words could ever convey. Good evening. Hurricane Katrina, one of the most powerful and dangerous hurricanes ever on record, slammed into the Gulf Coast this morning with winds as high as 140 miles per hour. The damage is immense and may take years to undo.
New Orleans, below sea level and now largely underwater. A levee break overnight finished what Hurricane Katrina started, flooding about 80% of the city under as much as 20 feet of water. People trapped in their homes scrambled to attics and roofs, where some may still be waiting for help.
Not only are we going to get hit, we're going to get hit with a big one.
The crisis one place simultaneously. Happening right now, a desperate and deteriorating situation in New Orleans. Water is rising and time is running out for hurricane survivors.
On Monday, August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina pummeled the Gulf Coast. The members of Lakeview Christian Center in New Orleans had already evacuated and were scattered across 6 states. Earlier that month, Senior Pastor Keith Collins had received the good news that, after 8 years of mutual consideration, his church had been officially adopted by Sovereign Grace Ministries. The plan was to announce it during a big celebration later that fall. But Katrina upended those plans and provided an entirely unexpected way of introducing Lakeview Christian Center to the Sovereign Grace family. At the same time, the staff of Christ Church in Newport, Wales, were busy with plans to celebrate the church's 10th anniversary that October. From its inception, Christ Church was infused with the doctrines and practices the pastors had absorbed from a small group of churches on the other side of the Atlantic. This is a story of 2 churches, but not just 2 churches. It's a story of God's sovereign purposes and sustaining grace in adding churches and starting new ones.
In the late 19th century, Charles Haddon Spurgeon spoke about something called the downgrade controversy. He was concerned about a downgrade in gospel truths and the effect that this would have on individuals and local churches, not only in his own time, but in the years to come. Well, here we are, over 120 years later, really reaping the consequences of that downgrade. We live in a country where less than 2% of the people will consider themselves evangelical Christians. And those that would, for many of them, they will be in churches that sadly obscure the gospel for those people in the country to hear. And it's within this context we find ourselves in Sovereign Grace in the UK, preaching the gospel, planting churches, and many times to people who have never even heard the name of Jesus.
Pete Greasley was one of those who did not know the gospel. Yet at 20 years old, he heard the good news from a friend who was himself a recent convert, and Pete became a Christian.
I think it was January or February 1981. Somebody called me and said, I've got a tape that I think you'd really enjoy. And the tape was called A House for God. It was teaching from Haggai and Malachi. And it was a young man by the name of C.J. Mahaney teaching on this tape. And so I sat and listened to this guy talk about God's desire for a house, a place where he could dwell unhindered, a place that we wouldn't have to tear down for the next generation to be able to walk with God. Was it a utopian ideal? I thought it must be, because I'd never experienced what CJ talked about in those early 80s. So I decided to, with my colleague Peter Bowley, take a look on the ground and see if what CJ had talked about when he was a young man was ever being built.
It was in 1995 that Pete and I first went to Pastors' Conference. I remember right in the final meeting when Pete and I were wondering which kind of direction we were going to go in, and somewhat perhaps in despair of the situation, saying to Pete that having seen what I've seen here, I really don't want to settle for anything less. It was in October of that year that we started Christ Church in Newport.
Christ Church continued an informal relationship with Sovereign Grace for the next 4 years, via conferences, books, and audio messages. In 1999, Sovereign Grace officially adopted Christ Church. Leadership team member Dave Harvey and his family moved there for 3 months that year to help Pete and Peter with the transition. Within a year, the foundations were in place for rapid future growth both in the UK and abroad. One of those major changes affected Peter personally. Christ Church was sending two of its young men, Nathan Smith and Dave Taylor, to the fourth year of the Sovereign Grace Pastors College. Weeks before leaving for the States, Nathan was to marry Peter's daughter, Claire. Their return to Christ Church was not guaranteed either, for Pete and Peter were already praying about planting a church elsewhere in the UK.
The initial church plant started off when the guys asked me during the PC class of 2000-2001 whether I would consider coming to Bristol to plant the church, and it was something that Claire and I had a faith to do at that point. And so when we returned from PC, I did a one-year internship at Christ Church with the view to planting the church, and during that year we started to put the call out to the people in Christ Church about who felt God was calling them to be part of the church planting team. And during that year we developed a small team of about 15 adults and a handful of children who really sensed that God was calling them to up sticks and move the 30 miles across to Bristol and relocate and change jobs and houses and leave their friends and their families behind and really sacrifice for the gospel for the sake of this church plant.
Grace Church began in the suburbs of Bristol with a team of 15 adults and a handful of children in September 2002. Nathan and Claire had their hands full with all the needs of a new church. But God had a surprise in store for them that would stretch their faith even further: triplets. Over the years, Grace Church of Bristol has grown to about 75 people, including children. With the growth of the church and the demands of a young family, Nathan needed help. It came in the form of his father-in-law, who this year came on staff as an associate pastor.
And one of the things that really affected me was when Pete challenged me and said, how could you be the most effective in your remaining years? And as I thought about that and prayed about that, I realized that with handing over more of responsibility in Christ Church to allow these young men to come through, I probably would be more effective over the remaining years by helping Nathan out here in Bristol.
Though Nathan Smith came back from the Pastor's College to plant a church, his fellow student Dave Taylor returned to Christ Church. As Pete Greasley began to take on more responsibilities for Sovereign Grace's regional leadership team, Dave shouldered more of the daily pastoral load at Christ Church. One of his major responsibilities is the large and lively Kids Club outreach. Christ Church has been running Kids Club for 4 years. They send 3 buses to pick up the children for the Saturday morning outreaches. In between, members make visits to the homes of Kids Club children. They give them worksheets containing coloring projects and Bible memory verses. Each meeting is a carefully orchestrated production, designed to present the truths of the gospel in a way that kids appreciate and understand.
Kids Club is a massive project. I think over the years we've had many kids obviously serve here. There's actually been over 3,000 children in the last 4 years come through those doors and hear about the Lord. So you can obviously imagine that the ratio is obviously huge. And at one point I believe we had over 60 adults serving in Kids Club just to make that possible. Because you've got everything from visitations through to the actual running on a week by week, through to the script writing, to the stage setup, to the PA stuff. And so it is a massive undertaking, but worthwhile, and we're pleased we've done it.
Over the years, this Church of 400 has also made an impact on other nations. When Sovereign Grace adopted Christ Church, we befriended their network of relationships in Uganda, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and other places. This past year, some of those churches joined the new Sovereign Grace Ministries Associate Program. In all of these relationships, Pete is mindful of the centrality of the gospel, even among the diversity of cultures.
There's a time to be culturally sensitive, and there's a time not to be. And where the culture contradicts the scripture, the culture must move. For many leaders in Africa, culturally, it's a male-dominated society, so we're teaching biblical manhood and womanhood from a completely different perspective than we would in the West. In the West, we're trying to address the issues of feminism gone wrong and address the issues of egalitarianism. And yet, in Africa, you're addressing the issues of chauvinism and misogyny and male domination. So husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and don't beat her. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and ensure that she eats all that she needs and don't you eat it. Things that to us we can't even begin to grasp.
Christ Church continues to cultivate new leaders. 2 years ago, Christ Church sent Tony Graham to the Pastor's College. Tony had every expectation of returning to be on staff at Christ Church. But as events unfolded, it became clear the providence of God was leading to a second church plant in the UK. That year at the Leadership Conference, Tony had met a guest named Gareth Lloyd, and they became good friends. But neither had any idea then of the events to come. Gareth had been a pastor in Merthyr Tydfil, a small town in the center of Wales. He discovered Sovereign Grace and contacted Pete Greasley. He had many questions about the Sovereign Grace blend of Reformed and Charismatic doctrines. Pete then invited him to attend the Leadership Conference. It was a costly invitation.
I'd only just returned from a conference in the States, which my church elders had said would be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and so it was something of a shock to them for me to ask their permission if I could attend another conference overseas. I think it was only the fact that it was free, somebody else was paying for it, that they allowed me to go. But during that conference, just had a life-transforming experience. Not primarily through the teaching that I heard. The teaching was excellent and confidence building, but really through the lives I encountered. I think for the first time, I spent a prolonged length of time with people who were grateful and not complaining, who were full of encouragement rather than criticism, and full of joy rather than miserable.
When Gareth returned, he discussed with his elders the changes he wanted to introduce to that church. It was not what the elders wanted. Thus, Gareth was relieved of his pastorate.
Between Pete Greasley, Pete Bowley, Tony in the States, I was receiving an awful lot of encouragement through the whole process. I certainly didn't feel alone, but there was no possibility in my mind that there would ever be a connection between myself and Christ Church. These were just some friends that I'd encountered that were encouraging me along the way. So the following day, I went out looking for a job, looking for a secular job. My intentions were to take my family to Christ Church, that we'd settle into the church, and I wanted to lead my family in some of these same values that I'd begun to appreciate, and just look to the Lord for the future, what He would have for us.
In Pete's assessment, Gareth was a man of unusual gifting and character, and he sensed God's leading in building this friendship. He offered Gareth a pastoral internship at Christ Church, with a view of going back to plant a church one day in Merthyr.
I'd love to plant a church in Oxford. I'd love to plant a church in Cambridge. There are strategic places that we would look at, not Merthyr. Merthyr is, in some ways, has been a dwindling population. Merthyr, going back to the turn of the century, was a huge commercial city where major ironworks were taking place, but not so now. It's a long story with many different facets. But the reality is, we became convinced that God wanted us to plant into Merthyr with Gareth, who was from Merthyr. We had a number of people in the church who had a desire to go to Merthyr. But Merthyr, even though it may not be strategic as far as the UK is concerned, is certainly strategic as far as the valleys of Wales are concerned, because it always has been a town where all the other towns feed into and feed out from. And so we're thrilled to be involved in there, and we're thrilled to be able to plant a church into an area where churches once were thriving, probably thriving beyond anywhere in the UK, but have now been shut down all over the place, and there's very little happening. But it's not something we would have thought of ourselves. We were clearly led by the Holy Spirit into that.
This past summer, Sovereign Grace Church of Merthyr Tydfil celebrated its first anniversary. It holds the distinction of being the first Sovereign Grace Church to meet in a castle. It started with a core team of 42 people, mostly from Christ Church, but also a few who knew Gareth previously. The church now has between 65 and 75 people attending each week.
I think we're in an interesting period. Without question, you couldn't describe our society now as a Christian society. Christendom has ended. But I see that as a positive rather than a negative. I think certainly in the Welsh valleys, morality and religion were rife the first half of this century. Beyond the 1904-05 revival, gospel-centered truth became morality. And so we had decades of high church attendance, chapel attendance, but the gospel wasn't being preached. Morality and religion predominantly were being preached. And now we have a society of almost 100% people who don't attend church, know nothing about the gospel. And so we have a seed bed to scatter the seed of the word and to grow a new harvest of gospel-won souls. And so I find these exciting times, not disastrous times.
The excitement was evident when a short-term missions team from Covenant Life Church arrived in July. They came to help with a week-long outreach in Merthyr. The week ended with a free community fair at the park where the church meets. Despite a record heat wave, the guests stayed twice as long as the team planned. And more showed up the next day for church and a free lunch following the meeting.
Yesterday in the event itself, we reckoned at the peak there was probably a little over 1,000 people. The park ranger, who's been working for the council for a couple of decades now, said he's never seen an event like that in the park. So naturally we were delighted to hear that. And just this morning in the meeting itself, we've had something in the region of 15 to 20 guests. It's just been a wonderful weekend.
Church planting in the UK is a real challenge. It is anywhere, but it's uniquely a challenge here as opposed to America, in the way that we have such a small Christian population to start with. Statistically, if you look across the UK, the average size church is 20 to 25 people. So a church around our size, which would have just over 400 members, would be considered a mega church, which is funny, but that's the way it would be seen in light of everybody else and what's going on. So you can't plant a church and anticipate Christians joining your church. So really, if you're going to plant a church, it must be, by its very nature, evangelistic right from the start. I talk to pastors from all over this country. In fact, I've been talking to a man who's been very involved and wanted to plant churches in Wales, godly man, a real desire to plant churches, who was asking me how we do it. So I said, well, we firstly determine where God would have us plant a church. We then look for a man that God has called to plant the church. We then send him to Pastor's College. We then equip him through Pastor's College. He then comes back. He then does an internship. He may then be an assistant pastor, and then we'll send him out. We'll support him financially fully for the first year. We'll support the church financially fully for the first year. We'll then look if they need more support after that. And as I'm speaking, the man's mouth is dropping to the ground because it's alien to any thought here. How can you do this? And so when people say, how do you church plant? And I'm almost embarrassed to tell them because they're coming to ask my advice. And I'm basically saying, well, we church plant because we're part of Sovereign Grace and from Sovereign Grace. Christ Church don't church plant on their own. Sovereign Grace church plants. We're just the base from where it comes. So it's a privilege to be able to let people know what happens, but it's also difficult because this isn't the norm.
Tommy, where we're standing, if this is September the 1st, we couldn't reach up and touch the top of the water, could we?
No, we could not. No, the water was probably
6
about
feet over our head, maybe.
It was about 12 feet, 11 and a half, 12 feet where we're standing right now. This would be the marsh. This came in from the Gulf of Mexico.
We're St. Bernard Parish. We're not far from the Gulf of Mexico.
No, we're not.
This is a unique place. Tommy, you grew up here. It is known in this area. The folks who live here are amongst the most loyal residents that you will ever meet.
Correct.
They don't want to live anywhere else. This is home. Generations have been born and raised here. What are you hearing from your neighbors about coming back?
Out of over 88 homes on this particular street, only one family's coming back. And for people of this community and of this parish to say that they're not coming back is almost unheard of. It's almost unheard of.
Yeah, it is. I can't imagine somebody from St. Bernard Parish living in another parish. It's just hard to imagine.
I don't think in my lifetime this parish will ever be what it ever was, that I know of it, that I can recollect of it.
Lakeview Christian Center sits to the northwest of downtown New Orleans. Areas west of the city were spared a direct hit from the hurricane. Areas east of downtown, such as St. Bernard's Parish, were not. But when the city's levee protection system was breached, Lakeview was flooded. After the storm, the pastors were among the first to get back to the city. Cell phone service was non-existent, so the pastors communicated with their far-flung members via a website. It was clearly evident that the rebuilding would take a long time. The planned celebration to announce the Sovereign Grace connection was scrapped. Instead, the news was released with the announcement of a Sovereign Grace Hurricane Katrina Disaster Recovery Fund. Donations and offers to help started pouring in, eventually raising more than $450,000. More significantly, on behalf of Sovereign Grace, Chip Chu of Metro Life Church in Orlando began to coordinate volunteer crews from among other Sovereign Grace churches for the cleanup effort. With limited shelter available in New Orleans, one Lakeview family opened their home. It served as the base camp for volunteers arriving from Sovereign Grace churches across the country.
The whole process of Sovereign Grace teams coming in and all that, really, at first, we didn't know how long that was going to happen. We knew a team was coming in, like one team, and then it just seemed like every week there was another team coming, and just to where 6 weeks into it or so, it was like, all right, so when's the next team coming in? You know, it just kind of happened. About 12 weeks, it was about 3 months, a little over 3 months of teams coming in. There were probably about 140, 150 people that we got to see come through the doors.
We have been familiar with Sovereign Grace for many years because we've gone to conferences, and so knew a lot of it. Felt like kind of like family, but maybe distant relatives. And you know, going from that to walking down the hall and seeing Sovereign Grace people walking out of your bathroom, you know, was like been a big jump. But we have gone from distant relatives to a real close family now. I hope they are saying the same thing about us.
I think it was good for the church too. We had a lot of people that were familiar with Sovereign Grace and that went to the conferences, but we also, through Alpha, we had a lot of new people to the church, and so there were people like, Sovereign what? You know, who are these people? And so I think it was good also for the church to have groups come in and Sovereign Grace to not just be this name that's over the church, but it's the guy that's, you know, tearing your wall out for you. That's Sovereign Grace, you know. And so I think it was good for the church. I mean, for us personally too. I mean, we just loved meeting people, but it was just good for them to see the effects of what it means for our church to be part of Sovereign Grace now.
While this family served the cleanup crews, the Lakeview members were especially touched by the consideration these crews had for their possessions and memories. It was a form of ministry they received with gratitude.
Sovereign Grace Ministries comes and guts my house out on the Sunday and Monday after Thanksgiving. And I get here with these 9 men and 2 women. And again, the Lord showed me and revealed to me how a humble servant is supposed to look like. This is what a Christ-like man and woman should look like. And when they went through my house, every single room of my house, they asked me, is there anything you want to go through before we go in there? Is there something you want to tell us about? Is there something you want us to look for?
There were 2 teams that came in and cared for our family and helping tear things down and pull things out, and it was the 2 teams from Phoenix. I just remember being on the front lawn, and a guy, Jim, came and just said, you know, I want to show you something. And he brought me into the hallway, and these are the markings of our children just over the years of them just growing up here. And he said, would you like me to save that? And I was just so blessed that he would take the time to get this piece of paneling off, because it just meant a lot to our family. So I'm just grateful for the people that have come and the teams that have come in week after week and have cared for not only my family, but our church family as well. Just their love and their support and wanting to serve and care for us at such a difficult time. So I am grateful to Sovereign Grace.
By January, the busyness of disaster recovery was being replaced with the Katrina pause. Life seemed to be on hold in multiple areas as state and local governments, employers, and insurance companies hedged their bets about the future. People were still shuffling in and out of the city, and Keith Collins was facing pastoral challenges in caring for a scattered flock, a body that may never fully reconstitute.
I remember a morning when it really hit me. I woke up to the news that my children's grandmother was moving to Texas, and we'd have to explain that to them. And I think the thing that pushed me over the edge was, you walk with people for years. I've had the privilege of being in this church since I was 19 years old. I just came in as a college student, and so I've known some of these folks since I was 14 years old, just had friendships and relationships through the years. And then I moved in the role of pastoring them, so I've had a friendship, watched their families grow, pastoral relationship with these guys for years. And you start getting messages from people like that and the folks that you've built with for years that it doesn't look like we're gonna be able to come back. Our offices are moving. Corporate offices decided to close the branch in New Orleans. We're gonna be in Houston now. And the morning that was the worst for me was I'd begun to hear a lot of that by this point. And I got a text message from a friend who I've known since I was a teenager. He and I were almost like brothers. And he had text messaged me that he was having to relocate to Houston. I'd watched his family grow up, and he has teenage daughters now. And in that moment, just kind of brought it together for me. I remember just closing the bathroom door and not wanting my family to see me fall apart. And just weeping and weeping and weeping. And yet in that moment, it was a strange feeling. I think it was more just the emotion of all that had been taking place. At this point, we're still in a hotel. We're watching these gruesome scenes from New Orleans. You're watching the places of your life and your history that's all come to pieces. And there's so much uncertainty and question as to what's going to happen. And all that balling up together. I didn't feel despair, knowing that God is faithful, but just in the same moment saying, God, this is awful painful to walk through. And pastorally to watch people's lives that you have cared for and invested in, and to wonder, do we have a future together? And maybe I'm a selfish pastor. I love the fact they all learned this trick when they would call. Their good news was, but there's a Sovereign Grace Church in this city. If they were in one location or another, they would know that was going to ease the salve by letting us know there was a Sovereign Grace Church in the city where they were thinking they were going to have to relocate.
In January, Danny and Melody Jones came from Metro Life Church to visit Lakeview, 5 months after Katrina. Keith and the other Lakeview pastors drove the Joneses around the city. The water was gone, but the damage remained. Some houses had been cleaned out. Others had disgorged their moldy contents on the street. Some were simply abandoned. It was hard to fathom, even though Danny had been in constant contact with the Lakeview pastors.
This would be one of the houses that was both gutted and helped to clean out. I know Covenant Life was one of the teams that worked on this. There was another team that helped out as well. This would be a single gal in our church who owns this house. She is currently displaced, actually caring for her mother in Houston. But the teams, as you can see, when the teams would come in, they would literally have to just strip everything down to the studs. And every bit of flooring, every bit of furnishing, every bit of appliance had to be taken out. The water in this area, again, would have been ceiling height. And so it necessitated everything just coming completely out.
When the tour was over, some big decisions still loomed about the church's future. That same weekend, the pastors met with a contractor and an architect to discuss options for the church building. Since Katrina, Lakeview has been meeting in a series of borrowed buildings on Saturday mornings, an impediment to those who work on Saturdays and a hindrance to consistent outreach. But the Lakeview area wasn't bouncing back quickly, and this gave the church the opportunity to lead the way in revitalizing the neighborhood. The pastors made the decision to demolish the old facility and expand into a new building. With that decision came unprecedented favor from local and state governments, civic groups, and nearby property owners.
The local civic groups, they were amazing. We had time together with them. We'd share the project, show them the pictures of the building. And what began with, would you guys help us, ended with them asking, how can we help you? They were excited to be a part of it. And then there was the individual neighbors that needed to all be willing to sell to us at reasonable prices. And so 8 different neighbors eventually all said yes. And I remember one of the things that our real estate agent was doing is he would just share the vision of the church and what we were about and with the folks that we were trying to buy from. And that really was, for many of them, the reason that they were willing to say, we'd be willing to have a church on our property for that kind of a thing to happen in the future.
While plans for the church facility move forward, many Lakeview families are still unsettled. And when this year's hurricane season rolled around, the temptation to anxiety increased.
Well, when June 1st hit, the initial start of hurricane season, I would have to say that it piqued my anxiety a little bit, because when you see such devastation, and it's still fresh in everyone's minds as you look through my neighborhood, there's trailer after trailer. It created a little bit of anxiety, yet, the peace of the Lord has certainly been there for us, and that's why we feel led to go ahead and rebuild, just as the church is rebuilding in Lakeview.
The rebuilding of Lakeview encompasses more than just creating a larger facility. Members attest to a new spiritual depth that continues to develop because of this crisis.
I think in terms of the church that we have gone through layers and layers of experience that just have brought us deeper in our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. I mean, I've had so much sin exposed in my life during this storm and the time after that, and I'm really glad about that, I'm like glad to see it and glad to deal with it. And I just feel like that's a statement that everybody can make. We've all experienced so much.
People say, would you have it happen all over again? The answer is definitely yes. Because if I was still living here and the hurricane didn't hit, would I still be vegging on the couch and watching the sports channel and watching all the other stations that I was watching and having dust 3 inches thick on my Bible because I couldn't even tell you where the book of Isaiah was? So I feel very blessed for what the Lord gave me and showed me what it's like to have these things in my life. I feel blessed that He took them away from me, even though it hurts to a large degree. But I feel the most blessed for what I have in my life right now.
We definitely learned a lot as far as serving the church and what that really means, where before the storm I wouldn't have signed up on a sign-up list to have 15 guys come live with me, but at that time it was the next thing. It was what was needed at the time, and we were available to do it, and it's kind of been like that since then.
Though it's been difficult, it has been so good for our family. Just to see your kids learn a lot of things as they grow up in the church, but to see our boys in particular, just us having to communicate with them in ways we never have before. I'm thankful to the Lord for that. Just having to get to heart issues and dig, and that takes time. We've been very blessed, so it has been good for us, just as a family, as a whole. And if you would have told me a year ago, the Lord, would have let us, in on this in any way, I would have said, no thanks. But God in His sovereignty has certainly just known what our family would need, and I'm grateful for Katrina. I'm thankful. I can stand here this day and say, thank you, Lord, for Katrina.
Alpha.